I got two handicaps. Not only am I a faculty member, I can't stand being behind a podium. For those of you who did it, it's the one thing that makes me nervous as a public speaker. People are like, you get awards for public speaking. And I say, have you ever seen me stand behind a podium? So I'm going to try and do this double-fisted with my slides and the mic, and we'll see how it works. If not, I might have to put the mic down and yell at that back table and see if you can hear me and ask you to give me a thumbs up. So this talk, I was asked to join you all in September. I want you to close your eyes and think back to September of 2024, what the world felt like for you in September of 2024. And when you call on that feeling, that's when I said yes. So I want to say that out loud. That's when I said yes to this talk. That is where I ground my memory of being here and starting my path to here is back in September of 2024, where my work looked a little different or was threatened to look a little different. So I've titled this One Hand of Mutual Progress. What does it mean to work towards a collaborative approach? And whenever I have the opportunity to share some love with my adopted hometown, I am not originally from Baltimore. I've learned about Baltimore. My career's been there for over 20 years. I do take a minute to shout out Baltimore, in part because most of my work is there. Now, the reference of my title, anybody familiar what the reference to my title comes from? Anyone? Any scholars of the late, great Booker T. Washington? So I love the debates that are between W.E.B. and Booker T, and wish I could have been a fly on the wall when they were alive to argue about what it means to be integrated in Black society, post-Reconstruction. Like, I love understanding what happens. And I take my quote from one of probably Booker T. Washington's most controversial lectures. It was in 1895, and he talked before a mostly white audience, as he tended to do. That was one of the debates between he and W.E.B. And one of the things that he shared was this quote, and this is probably the most widely quoted section of that speech. In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand, and all things essential to mutual progress. And when you first read and you think about what he's saying here, fundamentally what he's advocating for, segregation, what he's saying is, in very real words, we are different, but we are all in the same space. And further readings on this particular quote in this particular lecture, one of the things I will tell you, my place from public health is I fundamentally believe we cannot ignore history and we cannot ignore context, which is why I'm rooting this in sort of a discussion of what I think is a very important foundational experience of how we start the issue of disparity. And that starts very early on. That is a part of what's baked into this country. And I think this quote was his way of saying, inequalities exist amongst different groups, and they have been created that way. And if we expect one group to do what another group is doing, we in fact need to acknowledge that that finger looks different. That finger may need some other support. That finger may need some help. And so I want to start us here. That's why I use this title. This is one of the reasons I just want to share with you where I'm going and why I started here, is because the notion that we are all separate is one I think we can resonate with. We've heard people talk about their different trajectories and who they are and their culture and how they get here. That is not to be ignored. That is to be celebrated. That is also to be acknowledged, that that's how difference happens sometimes. The other thing I'm going to do for you is remind you that let's talk a little bit about Baltimore. I do have a next slide. So Baltimore is one of the oldest cities in the United States. It was established in 1729. It was around that same East Coast corridor that was being established. Baltimore is technically a southern city. Maryland is below the Mason-Dixon line. Baltimore was both a freed and slave city when it was enacted as slavery. So how does that play out? That plays out that part of the city, and I'm going to show you the city, part of the city was free, part of the city was enslaved, you did not cross, if you were black, into those different areas. Imagine someone who was in a free Baltimore goes to the enslaved part of Baltimore, you are fair game to then be captured and treated as an enslaved person. Anybody know Harriet Tubman? Raise your hand if you know Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman, proud Marylander. Anybody know when Harriet Tubman died? Anybody? Google it. Anybody? Come on, help me out. I'm going to start you out. Anyone? I like the speaking. 13, all right, somebody Googled it. 1913. I have family members that I knew as a child who were born in 1910. So the reason that I'm bringing this up to you is because I want to give you context. That when people say slavery was so long ago, Harriet Tubman, who was not the last enslaved person to be alive in the United States, died in 1913. So when we talk about context and we talk about importance, and I get to throw out Harriet Tubman because she moved up and down our corridors, she draws us together in context. Not only was she a Marylander, but she came up through the North. And I think she shows you context is really important when it comes to the trajectory of a community. I say that because I want to point out my, third bullet? 1/3 of youth, my second bullet. Baltimore is largely segregated by race and income. And when you get to that third bullet, 1/3 of Baltimore youth under the age of 18 live in low resource neighborhoods. Youth who live in those neighborhoods compared to their partners who live in higher resource neighborhoods are up to twice as likely, depending on where you are, 5 times as likely to experience violence. That's either as a perpetrator or a victim or what we're now calling sort of a trauma witness. It fundamentally changes them from being able to experience it. Why do I put that up there? Because I want us to think about, as we move forward, what is the definition of community? We've spent time talking about community. Researchers tell us community has 3 real functions. One is geography. It's where we are. It's the geographical, physical space that we share, that we use for sustenance, that we use for policy, that we use for all kinds of things. Collective identity, this is where we tend to go when it comes to race or when it comes to religion or when it comes to all the things that we do because we've been told that's what we do because that's who we are. This gets a little more to that concept of culture, and then we've been told patterns of social interaction. And I think that's what we're doing here, my friends. We are together because we believe this type of work is important. And even though those other 2 things might not be how we identify as a community, that third one is we are acting our community norms as we sit in this room. And I bring that up because I want to go back to my story of Baltimore. And this is a map. This map was created by the Urban Institute in looking at patterns of race and ethnicity in Baltimore. Lawrence Brown termed the coin the white L and the black butterfly. So it's hard to see, but I think you can make it out. I like this rendering because I think it's kind of artistic. The blue here, it's not black. The blue is, in fact, highly populated black locations. The red or pink, depending on how you look at it, is what we call our white L. The reason that I want to put this up here, having given you the story of Baltimore, is because this is where segregation really begins. These 3 different geographic patterns, the left, the L, the right, all are steeped in history. They exist very fundamentally because that's how the city was created. And that's how we look at the issue of when I say things like slavery continues to bear its fruits today, this is how we get here. Now, the other thing you might know or might not know is the term redlining. Anybody heard of the term redlining? I see some hands. Do you want to shout out what it is? Right, so it was a practice. It started in the 1930s. Anybody know when it ended? When it officially ended in the 60s. We're in the 60s. We got the organizers over here. 2020, right. Some would say 2025. And we can get there, how the legacy stays there. So it starts in the 1930s, right? We know Officially, it ends in the 60s, but what is it? Okay, so basically the federal legislature lets us know that people who are buying houses could buy them based on grade, could get a mortgage and investment in that community based on grade. And the grades were A through D, A being the neighborhood, and you can look this up, the neighborhood was all white and was mostly to be invested in. These are practices that were being developed by established cities that already exist. So you cannot say that the fruits of what were don't impact what is. So these practices started in order to maintain the investment in the neighborhoods that were predominantly white. And then you go to D. D, and on the maps, and if you Google this, they would draw a red line around them. That red line would go around neighborhoods that were mostly, actually they were all black. That's what the words were. Black people live in these communities. Again, you can Google it because I think the Google box can be a helpful educational tool. And if you're not aware, Baltimore is the originator of redlining. You're welcome. That's where it starts. So I put that out there to share to you when people come up to me and I say I do my work in Baltimore and I'm super proud of what the city stands for and all of the things that it's done. I also know it has a lot of challenges deeply rooted in race and racism and in issues around what it means to belong and who builds this country. The reason that I bring that up when I talk about Baltimore and people are like, wow, you're so excited about Baltimore, is because Baltimore is doing exactly what Baltimore was designed to do. It was designed to keep young Black people in certain areas and designed to thrive in others. This is where my story, my love story of Baltimore begins, because the other thing we know about history is when you know it and you can see it, you can change it. And it's not easy, it's not fast. I mean, it didn't take, the reason I start with Harriet Tubman is because it takes us a long time to get here, and it's gonna take us a long time to change. Now, one of the big issues I've already brought up, and I wanted to tee you up that I'm gonna talk about is violence. Safety is probably a more appropriate word when we get to it. Baltimore does have an issue of violence, and I'm going to use the definition of violence that's from the World Health Organization, which is the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, against a group or community that either results in or has a high likelihood resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. I use this definition when I teach about violence, in part because I want to explain the totality of what violence does to a community. Regardless if it's gun violence, violence in and of itself develops you in a way that makes you trauma response to everything. And if you're like, Vanya, you're throwing all those buzzwords out, trauma response is just a reminder that we try and hold on to what we have when we have it. And sometimes that means defending it in ways that other people don't understand. That's my moral take home about violence. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, and feel free to ask me questions if you want to. And so I put this up here because I don't want to share that I am not ignorant of the history of violence and what the nation thinks about my city when it comes to violence. We have had our own experiences and we tend to continue. But I also want to point out, let me go back one before I get there. I also want to point out that there are lots of people in Baltimore looking at this issue of violence. I'm not the only one. I have a very specific focus. If you ask me about my work when it comes to violence prevention, I partner with emergency departments across the city to help young people who got into a fight with another young person at school. This is usually between the ages of 10 and 15. We know within 5 years, they're probably gonna, if we don't solve this problem of conflict and dealing with it, they're probably gonna come back and with gun violence. And the other thing I can tell you is the young people that I work with, this 10 to 15-year-old that shows up in the emergency department, for about 15 years, if a gun was involved, it was involved with a hitting, it was not involved as a shooting. So we know there is a pathway there that we can work with for these young people. In that role, I was tapped by the president of Johns Hopkins to say, hey, we should do something about safety. We have a lot of issues. There's a lot of people who we'd like to bring to this university, and then they hear, it's really funny the amount of people who don't realize Johns Hopkins is centrally located in Baltimore, and I'm gonna show you that in a minute. They hear, and they wanna come here, and then they come here, and then they're like, oh, but it's in Baltimore. Do you feel safe? So what he said was, let's try and think about how we can make people feel safer when they come to our campus. At the same time he was doing this, he was enacting legislation to create the Johns Hopkins police force. I cannot tell this story without telling the fact that at the same time we were doing this community work, we were also creating a police force. Again, you probably Google it so you can find that out. A police force, I've done a little bit of work with police and I appreciate their jobs. It's a very hard job. But when you look at it from a researcher perspective, they have one real job, that's to respond when there's an issue. Their job, in the way it's trained, is not prevention. And I've had plenty of police officers tell me that that's a challenge, and we often look to them to prevention, but that's not what we're trying to do. And so what we were looking at with this innovation fund for community safety, I want you to look at the word safety because it changed from violence prevention to safety, was not about how do we engage police, but about how do we create a community around, the communities around Johns Hopkins to feel safer. So our president decided to invest, this was 2021, so we're in the thick of COVID, decided to invest $6 million in order to look at how do we improve safety around Johns Hopkins University campuses, and it was to be for 4 years, so you can get money for 4 years. Now, we sat around and we came up with, well, what do we give money out for? How do we do this? And came up with 4 main themes. It had to define safety. So one of the things I pushed is that safety is one of those terms that you throw out there and not everybody will define the same. In fact, if I asked 10 of you to raise your hand and define safety for me, I'd probably get 10 different definitions. Next, it had to have a project that's physically adjacent to a JHU campus. And we left that loose. They had to describe how they were putting it physically adjacent to a JHU campus. We had to define collaboration between community organizations and Johns Hopkins. There had to be a relationship in their application. And then there was this interesting part, and I'll tell you, this was probably hardest for everyone who was an academic in the room. This was the part that was hardest for them, was align JHU affiliate, mostly faculty, mostly researchers, interests with community interests. They had to tell us how this partnership actually benefited the community and was aligned with the work you do. Now, there's a lot of reasons why we came up with that. And again, if you want to ask, I'm teeing up questions if you'd like to ask any later, just so you have some queued up. So where does Johns Hopkins sit in Baltimore? I don't know if this little pointer, oh, it works, friends, it works. All right, the original campus, right here in the middle. Johns Hopkins started in East Baltimore with a hospital and the university was built around it. The second campus is our Homewood campus. The original campus was developed to provide services to the Black population, the indigenous Black population. Those are the language that Johns Hopkins used. He is a man, that is one person. His name was Johns Hopkins, to create the hospital. Then we built the university, and it's in, has anyone ever been to Hopkins? Can you tell me which campus you were on? Okay, so you had concrete and no trees. I saw a hand back there. The East Baltimore campus. Anybody been to our Homewood campus? Anyone? Anyone? What does it look like? It is beautiful. It is green. It is marbled. It's got brick. It's got some old trees. It's got one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Maryland, located right next to it in Maryland, not in Baltimore, right next to it. It is a lovely campus. It's up here. And then we have Bayview, which is our newest of campuses. It's really interesting. The hospital developed around a lot of different spaces, but this was a neighborhood, and it still is, that was mostly Greek. This is a very interesting ethnic neighborhood, and I put ethnic in quotes, in part because one reason they were able to buy up over there is because there were lots of little different community hospitals that have come together, and they were able to put them together because they were serving these different constituencies. And so I want to, again, go back to the fact history matters in the context of where you're doing work, because when we asked for programs to be applied to adjacent to Hopkins universities, these were the areas we were asking people to find out safety. So I'm not going to tell you what came from which area, but I will tell you how we did this, which is we wound up looking at 40 applications to spoil the ending. We got 11. But the question, and I throw this out to you, the question is, okay, President Johns Hopkins comes up to you and says, we want to give $6 million out. What do you do? What do you do? Do you create a committee? Do you go to JHU leadership? What do you do? Throw out some ideas. Any thoughts? Engage the community. I heard an RFP. Who said that? What would you put in it? Oh, some consensus funding. You have to build some consensus. So we engage the community. We build some consensus. What else do you do? Look at data. What data would you want? So what are the issues? What are the things that make someone feel unsafe? Well, all of those things. Yes, you do all of those things and all of those things came up. And what the president said was, okay, we're never going to give out money if we keep doing this. It's going to be some strange iterative process. So will you help co-chair a committee? And I said, I will help co-chair a committee if there is a community member who I am a co-chair with. So we had a second co-chair. I'm not going to name her because if you Google this now, there is a new round of funding, and we can talk about that. There's another TO question for you. So we have two co-chairs, a faculty member and a philanthropic executive who happen to be a Baltimore native. 3 community partners who all applied through different ways from their organization or from, we had one person that was not affiliated with anything. She was a neighbor who lived around one of the Baltimore campuses. We had 3 JHU affiliates, 2 faculty members, and 1 current board member. We had 1 college student, and I'm going to say her age because it's important. She was 19. We had 1 high school student, and I'm going to say her age because it was important. She was 16. So when my colleague and I sat down and was given the list, we did not pick these people. These people were picked by the university. I didn't pick my committee. I couldn't tell you what their application said to get on, but they got on. What I will tell you is I got the list, I got their bios, I sat down with my co-chair, and I said, we have a slight issue here. Our job is to both come to an agreement of what it means to be safe amongst these people and to make sure the value of the input of a 16-year-old is the same as a Johns Hopkins trustee. The exact same, with no reservation. How do you do that? This was one of those moments where I was like, I think I may have just gotten myself in trouble when it comes to my career. Because this is one of those moments where you sink or swim for real, right? And so she and I decided in one of our earliest meetings, that was our goal. Our goal was not to define what safety was around Johns Hopkins. Our goal by virtue of the process was to be able to have this committee identify things that were important to them when it came to safety and to be able to present programs that they thought reflected what the selection meant from them. I'm here to tell you right now the reason that I put this slide up here and why I decided to give this talk. I went back and forth about how much to share with you, what talk to give. This is a brand new slide, and I'm sharing this one because the one thing that I want you to take away is when you are in the room, and by virtue of sitting here, I know you are in rooms. By virtue of being in this space, I know you have leverage. When you are in rooms, take the moment to remember what your job is and what you're doing when you're in those rooms. Because at that moment, we made a real choice. So we decided it was going to be an equitable process for everyone on the committee. We wound up having 1 orientation meeting, and that was about how to review the grants, what the grants were about. We had 5 3-hour selection meetings, and in those selection meetings, I'll tell you what we did in a minute, but we wound up giving 2 presentations to Johns Hopkins leadership, 1 midway to tell them what we were doing and how we were going, and 1 at the end to tell them what we selected. We actually asked them not to be a part of our process because we didn't want their influence on what we decided was important. May not have been the best decision, but it's the one we made. So one of the things we did was build an approach that was inclusive. Both of the youth who were on the committee, they wound up meeting with one of the chairs before every meeting. We talked about what their main points were, what they would like to share. Next was supporting each committee member. We had a dedicated staff person. We went to the president's office and said, we need someone who is responsible for notes, for organizations, for all the things. We cannot be doing that and running this committee at the same time. Think of what are the resources that you might need. We had multiple emails with links. No one ever had to ask, where is document X? It's my least favorite thing to do in a meeting. And so we made sure that was really clear. We also told in that orientation meeting, here's our strategy for conflict resolution. We're gonna have grants that you wanna fund because you know these people. Baltimore's nickname is Smaltimore. We love it because we know everybody. You are 1 degree from one person if you were living in Baltimore. We know this. You're gonna know these people. We have to make sure we're looking at this with the same lens, and so we told them our conflict plan. It changed a little as we were together. And then each committee member received the same stipend. You wanna have get leadership up in arms. Tell them the amount of money that the trustee thought was appropriate for being a part of this is the same amount of money you're gonna give a 16-year-old. Yeah, they have some words for you. At the end, they understood what we were trying to do, because if we want to actually have this young person be a part of our committee, we have to start somewhere. So some of the things that we did around building a pattern of social interaction, see I'm trying to tie it all together, was we created a shared understanding of terms for violence and safety. If you've read any grants around violence, you're gonna hear things, this is probably true for any health issue out there, you're gonna hear words like at risk, high risk, you're gonna hear words about impact and prevention. All of those things we realized early on, we all had a different opinion on what they meant, and they were all loaded. And so we spent a little time, my co-chair and I, when someone would bring up one of those words and talk about it in a certain way, we created a lexicon. I actually, to this day, have a definition book of all the words we used. We thought about publishing it in a peer-reviewed journal, but then decided some of that was based on discussion that was heated and emotional, and some of our members might not want to relive some of those experiences. So I'm not sharing the definition, but I am telling you that that they exist. We considered diverse views. Universal questions were created for looking at each grant, understanding that everyone was going to bring their own lens. We had to have some place that we started from a common lens, and that was creating some questions. Everybody voted anonymously on every single grant, and we prepared discussions that each person, including that 16-year-old, had to present when it came to discussing grants. And then we came up with what we meant by short-term impacts on safety, intermediate impacts on safety, and long-term impacts on safety. Some people really thought passionately about certain things, other people wanted other things. And so I'm putting that out there just in a big picture to tell you words matter, and everybody's bringing their own lens to the words. So the decisions, what do we do? Each grant had 3 different people provide them. We revisit the lexicon when we needed to. We discuss the budgets. You can't talk about giving out grants without talking about money. And we set up a firm timeline for the process. Our original timeline was 3 review rounds. We wound up adding 2 because of the amount of discussions that we had. So, what's the big so what? We had 4 different types of grants that we decided to look at. There was police. People did submit grants about police. There were programs, think after school programs and arts programs. There was access to social services, think legal aid, think social healthcare and social services. There was environmental modifications, lighting, green space, all the things that you probably thought about when I said safety. What do you do? All of those showed up in those 40 grants we had to look at, and we had to spend the money, and we whittled it down to 11. We wound up having everyone rank the ones that we chose, and we submitted that ranking to the president's office. Our job was recommendations. The ones that were chosen were ultimately the funders, which is the president's office. So, what did we do? We wound up choosing grants, and if you read through this list, there's only one that talks about what we would even get close to policing. And that one is No Boundaries Coalition, which was block captain leadership training. This particular grant wanted people to understand what it meant when you called police, when you were leading your community and you were leading your group from somewhat of a very organizing space. We also had intimate partner abuse, food science for youth, dirt bike culture and STEM. We had male mentoring to address trauma, outreach to staff to connect people who are substance users or connect those who do sex work to health and social services. We had arts for youth and family. We had culinary arts education. We had one program that wanted to build relationships between new emerging populations and populations that had existed there for a long time. We had one service that was free bono legal services they wanted to provide in communities around Baltimore. And then we had some work around educational excellence. Now you look at these and you go, Vanya, how do those make people feel safe? And I ask you to remember the definitions of safety that I came up with earlier, which is psychological harm is also a part of it. This committee came up with these groups because this is what this committee decided was important. Now, were these the groups our leadership wanted? Not necessarily, but are these the things that the committee who was choosing thought were important? 100%. Everyone on this committee stood behind these. I want to also point out just a few, sort of things that we highlight in the story that I hope you found, which was reciprocity and solidarity. It was among the committee members. Community-led goals. Remember who was on our committee, that their partners and the people that they were going back to when they left this committee wasn't Johns Hopkins. It was the community where they lived. Behavior change is social change. We're always living in a context of where we need to acknowledge where we are. Power sharing is important, and if there's nothing you took away from this story, is that power sharing was the one thing we aimed to do. In sum, this was not just developing research projects, it was developing a shared vision, and fundamentally that is a very hard thing to do when we're all coming from our own lenses. So what about you? I'm ending here, and I always end and ask people to think about a few things. One is, when you're working with groups, what perspective are you broadening? What perspective are you bringing to the table? Remind yourself in what perspective you're broadening. You're never neutral. You're never neutral. You're always either upholding something or trying to advocate for change. They almost always don't exist in the same space. Commit yourself to actions and information that's collaborative. Think about how you expand leadership. And I love this quote from Fannie Lou Hamer: if there is a civil rights leader in the United States that embodies, sort of who I look to when it comes to the struggle of civil rights, if you don't know Fannie Lou, please look her up. When I liberate others, I liberate myself. Nobody is free until everybody is free. And I'm going to end here with a quote from Malcolm X. This was 1964. It was the one speech he gave in the Audubon Ballroom. If you know anything about his life, you know he's died the year later. I, for one, believe that if you give people a thorough understanding of what it is that confronts them, the basic causes that produce it, they'll create their own program. And when the people create a program, you get action. If there's nothing else that you're able to take away, remember that you have power in every room that you're in, and please, please use it and don't give it away. Thank you.